Brian Moser was one of the most dangerous killers in the Dexter universe. By Dexter's own code, he had to go. But what would have happened if Dexter spared Brian's life? Today, we're going to peel back the layers to see just how sideways this whole story could have gone. When the investigation into the ice truck killer began, no one at Miami Metro could have guessed how closely Dexter was related to the case. The ice truck killer shared a connection with Dexter that was far deeper than anyone realized. They were brothers, bound by blood and by immense trauma. As children, both Brian and Dexter witnessed the brutal murder of their mother, Laura Moser, who was killed and dismembered with a chainsaw by a notorious drug cartel for cooperating with police. The horrific reality of the two boys sitting in a pool of their own mother's blood, surrounded by her remains for days, shaped both of their lives, albeit in very different ways. As we know, Dexter was rescued by Harry Morgan, a detective from Miami Metro who adopted and raised a young Dexter to control his homicidal urges into something productive using the code. Brian, on the other hand, was left behind. They saw how difficult he was to rehabilitate. Brian was rejected by the Morgan family, institutionalized, and forgotten about. He grew up without any guidance and eventually became consumed by rage, fueled by the death of his mother, the rejection from the Morgans, and the fact that his brother was taken from him. Brian devolved into an obsessed maniac, stalking Dexter, killing anyone he thought had wronged him as a child. He went dormant for a while, but when he finally resurfaced as the ice truck killer, his attacks were not random. Every single murder was a gruesome message designed to awaken the memories that Dexter had lost after their mother was killed. Each crime scene Brian staged was a deliberate psychological puzzle meant solely for Dexter. The perfectly drained bodies, the precise dismemberment, the blood-filled room, and the locations, they were just all meant to help Dexter remember how their mother was killed and that he used to have an older brother. Brian believed that his brother shared his darkness and would stop at nothing to prove it. All of the blood, the placement of the corpses, were recreations of the violence that made them the killers they are. Brian wasn't trying to hide his crimes from the police. He wasn't afraid, and he knew that every piece of evidence was another breadcrumb that would lead his brother back to him. When Brian finally revealed himself, his intentions became clear. He didn't want to hurt Dexter. He wanted to free him. From his job, to his relationship with Rita, to his attachment to Deborah, Brian saw Dexter's entire life as a cage built by Harry's lies. Brian believed Harry brainwashed Dexter into believing he needed the code to justify what he was. But Brian had no need for those sorts of rules. To him, killing was a natural expression of who he really was, not something to suppress or channel. His attempt to kill Deborah wasn't just about removing an obstacle on his path back to his brother. Deb represented the false life that kept Dexter bound to mortality. If she died, Brian knew that Dexter would finally be liberated, free to embrace his true form, and able to join him in living without restraint. But when the moment came, Dexter couldn't do it. As much as he longed for his brother's acceptance and the intoxicating feeling of being seen for the first time, Dexter felt something deeper. There was a faint echo of humanity, and he loved Deb, even if he couldn't fully acknowledge that yet. Killing Deb would mean crossing a line he could never justify. In the end, Dexter had to make the difficult choice between protecting the only person who ever truly understood him and his loving foster sister, who for most of his life kept him tethered to sanity. When Dexter finally caught Brian, he tied him down and slit his throat. And it wasn't out of pure hatred, but more of a need to protect Deb and himself. And by killing Brian, Dexter wasn't just erasing his brother, he was also destroying the version of himself that could have become Brian. It was the ultimate sacrifice. He chose the illusion of light over the comfort of embracing his darkness, even if it meant losing his only biological family, who also happened to accept him completely. But what if he hadn't killed Biney? A lot of things would have gone down differently, starting with the demise of Sergeant James Dokes. After killing Brian, Dexter left his body to be found by police in a staged suicide. And shortly after the ice truck killer investigation wrapped up, The search for the Bay Harbor Butcher began almost immediately. Dexter was trying to hide his past crimes while also evading the suspicious and ever-present eye of James Dokes. Dokes didn't know that Dexter was the butcher initially, but he knew that he was associated closely with the ice truck killer, and he wasn't going to let that go until he got to the bottom of it. Without Brian around, Dexter had to navigate all of that on his own, and it wasn't very easy. Even after he had James subdued and locked in a cage, his problems were far from over because Dexter couldn't bring himself to kill James. Maybe he reminded him a little bit too much of himself. Even though he was trying to expose Dexter, James didn't exactly meet the code. He was technically an innocent, and killing him didn't sit right with Dexter. That wouldn't have been a problem for Brian. As soon as Dexter so much as hinted that James was causing a problem for them, Brian would have hunted the sergeant down and killed him without a second thought, in ways we probably couldn't even imagine. Lila wouldn't have had to come in to save Dexter in the 11th hour. In fact, Brian may have killed her too. Lila was also complicating his brother's life and refused to back down. Brian didn't need as many reasons to take someone out as Dexter did, so the mere annoyance of her existence would have probably been enough to put her in Brian's crosshairs. Brian seemed to enjoy killing, but he really only killed to avenge the trauma he faced as a child. He killed the people who wronged him in his foster homes. He killed the therapist that tried to keep him from Dexter after he was an adult, and he killed the woman who facilitated Dexter's adoption into the Morgan family, while casting him into the foster system. Later, he did kill a number of sex workers in Miami, but that was only so he could use their bodies to bring Dexter back to him. This pattern suggests that he didn't kill solely for pleasure, but for safety and utility. That would make the likes of Dokes and Lila fair game, and they wouldn't have been the only people Brian would have in his sights. As mentioned, Dexter's primary reason for killing Brian was to keep Deborah safe. Brian was obsessed not only with reuniting with Dexter, but getting rid of all the elements of his brother's life that he believed to be holding him back. That meant that Deb had to go, so if Dexter didn't take out Brian, Brian would take out Deb. Maybe he could have held off for a little while longer if Dexter asked him to, but Brian is a selfish, maniacal psychopath. Killing Deb would always be on the table. If Miami Metro kept hunting for the ITK, there is no doubt that Deb would be leading the charge. After pretending to be in love with her, fake proposing to her, and kidnapping her, there is no chance that Deb would ever let Brian get away with it all. Even if they took her off the case, she'd be working in the background to make sure karma caught up with that motherfucker. And with a detective as dedicated as Deb on the case, it wouldn't be long before the police caught on to him again. Knowing this, and understanding how it would negatively impact his brother's life as well, Brian would not waste any time taking Deb out once and for all. Just remember what Brian tried to do to Batista when he got too close to figuring it all out. He sloppily tried to shank Angel to death in a parking garage. The only difference is that he would be successful in killing Deb. He already hated her, and with the investigation continuing, he'd have every ounce of motive he'd need to hunt her down and take her out. If he was still alive and Deb was dead, Brian would try to convince Dexter that they were better off now that she was gone, and he might just succeed. Dexter has spent his entire life feeling isolated and rejected from the rest of the world. Even his foster family didn't fully understand or accept him. If Brian had enough time alone with Dexter, he may have been able to convince Dexter that the code was useless, that his life was a sham, and that he would be better off without anchors like Deb holding him back from being who he truly was. So if Deb died without Dexter being around to interfere, there is a chance that he would hunt down the person responsible and take him out. But if it was his only remaining family member, his true blood brother, he may just move on and accept his new life without the Morgans, allowing Brian to corrupt him completely and no longer feeling tied down by his past. See, the ITK is the new emperor of this galaxy, and Dexter is just the Darth passenger. That is definitely what Brian would be hoping for, and given how desperate Dexter is for acceptance, he may be swayed to accept it and let Brian live even after killing Deb. He forgave Hannah for trying to kill Deb after all, so it isn't that far of a stretch to assume that he'd do the same thing for his brother. And once that obstacle was overcome, the rest would all fall into place naturally, because Deb isn't the only family member that Brian would take out of the picture. Before you watch any further, I'm happy to finally announce that I'm releasing the first limited drop of my t-shirts. At the start, there are only 100 available, so make sure you buy them while you can at dtmerch.store. Enjoy the video. If Dexter had never killed Brian, his relationship with Rita would almost certainly have fallen apart long before they ever had a child together. In the original timeline, Rita represented Dexter's path toward normalcy. Rita and her kids offered a quiet, safe life built upon routine, trust, and emotional connection, even if it wasn't completely real. Rita was a disguise that allowed Dexter to blend in, and more importantly, she was the person who grounded him. That incredibly delicate balance would have shattered if Brian was allowed to live. Brian's presence would draw Dexter deeper into the darker parts of his true nature, tempting him to shed his carefully constructed mask. Dexter sought Rita out because he thought he needed to seem normal and didn't want to be alone all the time. Without the emotional isolation that led him to seek comfort in Rita, Dexter wouldn't need her. And without the discipline Harry's code enforced, he wouldn't value having her nearly as much. Brian would feed Dexter's darkest instincts, continuing to convince him that his domestic life was a facade, that pretending to be normal was weakness. Rita, with all of her innocence and need for honesty, would become a symbol of everything Dexter was trying to escape. Over time, Brian's influence would wear away what little empathy Dexter had learned to imitate. Knowing what living like Brian may feel like, Dexter would most likely become restless and detached. He'd lose interest in the quiet, predictable existence Rita offered, where she saw love and family. He would see confinement. Their relationship, in Dexter's eyes, would begin to feel like a prison of small talk, mandatory dinner dates, and emotional expectations he could no longer fake. Rita's trauma from her abusive past with her ex-husband Paul already made her sensitive to distance and dishonesty. She would sense Dexter's disconnection. The emotional void he no longer bothered to fight would be so apparent that she couldn't ignore it. They'd argue more, their trust would dissolve, and her insecurities would be inescapable. Brian, as a manipulative psychopath obsessed with claiming Dexter as his own, would undoubtedly push Dexter to abandon her entirely. He would make Dexter believe that Rita was part of Harry's lie and just another tool used to domesticate him. Even if Dexter didn't leave Rita outright, his divided loyalties between her and Brian would create cracks that couldn't be repaired. Soon enough, he wouldn't have a serious girlfriend or any connection with Rita's kids. Dexter would completely buy into Brian's way of life, and the need to cling to his former life would slowly fade away. That means no Harrison. Without Rita's emotional presence and stability, Dexter's life would tilt completely toward darkness. The idea of raising a child requires a sense of morality, love, and protection that Brian's influence would completely destroy. Harrison would never be conceived because Dexter would no longer be capable of maintaining the illusion of a loving relationship. Sparing Brian would strip Dexter of the very thing Rita brought out in him, that small human part that wanted connection. That would die. Without that, his bond with Rita would wither, his family life would collapse, and the future where he becomes a father would disappear. It would be sacrificed to the brother who taught him the loving relationship with Rita was just another weakness. The saddest part is that without Dexter's code or need to kill others, plenty of monsters would have continued terrorizing Miami completely unchallenged. It's unlikely that Dexter would have continued working at Miami Metro for too long after Brian evaded police capture. How could he? Dokes would still be on his tail. Deb would be looking for Brian high and low, and slowly but surely the connections would become all too clear. Dexter would be in jeopardy day in and day out at Miami Metro. The connections and abilities he has by working there would be hard to give up, but the idea of walking into work and being arrested on any given day is a chance that he couldn't take. If he wanted true freedom and actually abandon his code, working for the police would neither be necessary to find new victims or help him avoid detection. So in the latter seasons, who knows how, when, or if the big bads would have been caught. Trinity wouldn't have targeted Rita or ended up on Dexter's radar. Think about it. Dexter only began targeting Trinity so hard because he thought Trinity had attacked Deb and Lundy. But if Deb was already dead, why would Dexter have involved himself so closely with Trinity? And Trinity only targeted Rita because Dexter targeted him first. If Dexter never involved himself in the Trinity case, it would be up to the FBI alone to catch him. And they barely even believed that he was real. Only Lundy was pursuing Trinity, and he didn't exactly know who he was looking for. It is possible that Lundy would have eventually found out that Arthur was the Trinity killer, but it would have likely taken a lot more time, or at least been after Arthur had already kidnapped and killed the child he found in Miami, Scott. And if he went dormant again until another house build, he would be long gone before Lundy could get close to him. Remember that the only reason they knew to look at the house build sites is because Dexter saved the last boy Trinity was trying to bury alive, thus allowing him the opportunity to speak to police. When he did speak to police, he identified the logo for the organization that did the builds, and that narrowed the police's focus. If Dexter never involved himself with the Trinity case, there is a very high likelihood that the boy would have died, and with him, so too would the details of the logo, allowing Trinity to continue killing without being detected for who knows how long. And he isn't the only serial killer who would have gone unchecked. After Rita died, Dexter tried to get back into some form of routine. That's what led him to the Barrel Girls gang. But hypothetically, with Rita still alive and Deb dead, and his job at Miami Metro in the rearview mirror, and his code all but totally dissolved, why would Dexter have pursued Jordan Chase? Why would he help Lumen? She saw him kill Boyd Fowler, and with that knowledge, Lumen was better dead than alive for Dexter. And with Brian whispering in his ear for so long, breaking down the foundation that Harry created for him, Dexter would have been more open than ever to either doing away with Lumen himself or letting Brian do it for him. Either way, she wouldn't have lived much longer, and the remaining members of the Barrel Girls gang would have probably never been dealt with by Dexter. Hopefully Miami Metro Homicide would have caught up with them, because Dexter and Brian would have no direct interest in stopping them. And the same could be said for the Doomsday Killer. Because of his proximity to the police department, Dexter learned all about what the Doomsday Killers were up to. But because of his own personal interest in taking down random killers, Dexter cracked the DDK case well before Miami Metro was even close. By the end of the investigation, Dexter would have saved at least one of DDK's intended victims and managed to get the killer plastic wrapped to his table. But if Brian was alive and Dexter no longer felt the need to keep his job as a way to portray normalcy, what would have stopped him from completely ignoring the Doomsday Killers? He wouldn't have been personally invested. He would have been killing more frequently and with less restraint. So taking DDK out wouldn't be at the top of Dexter's to-do list. And the same logic can be applied to the rest of the big bads. From Trinity to the brain surgeon, there is very little chance that Dexter would focus on them if he was on a years-long, guilt-free murder spree with his brother. If Dexter and Brian became interlinked, there is no telling how many people would have fallen victim to the prolific serial killers Dexter eliminated. And maybe Maria LaGuerta would have lived, maybe Batista would have grown old, maybe Paul, Rita's ex-husband, would have stayed out of prison, been rehabilitated, and got to see his children Aster and Cody grow up. Although I guess really no one has gotten to see them grow up. Let's face it, Dexter saved a lot of lives by taking out serial killers, but he also caused the deaths of many innocents and hurt the people around him constantly. Brian would have shielded Aster, Cody, Rita, Maria, Angel, and so many others from being wrapped up in Dexter's twisted life. They would have been better off and had fuller, happier lives without Dexter. There would be no new blood, no need for a resurrection, no need for the rest of the original series itself. That means that grotesque cretins like Kurt Caldwell, Lowell Sloan, Mia LaPierre, the Gemini Killers, and more would have been free to murder whomever they pleased for as long as it took for police to catch them. Without the code, it would just be the story of two insane killers running the streets, targeting innocent victims, and getting away with it for decades, and no one really wants to watch that. I mean, forget about that movie, Natural Born Killers, for just a second. We would never root for Dexter. We would constantly be waiting for him to come to his senses and finally kill Brian and get back to the code. The fact of the matter is that Dexter and the rest of the world were better off with Brian dead. He was a deeply disturbed maniac with the morals of a cobra. He wouldn't hesitate to hurt, manipulate, or kill anyone he wanted. And by the way, that therapist he killed was really only trying to help him. So he doesn't even care if they are trying to help him or not at this point. And he would have undoubtedly manipulated and hurt Dexter. He would corrupt him completely if he lived. Even when Dexter hallucinates him, he urges him to be reckless and selfish. If he were really alive and had the opportunity to eliminate every positive influence in Dexter's life, he would have created a perfect monster, and he would have used it to his own benefit at every turn. But much like the prosthetics that Brian works with, a lot of his life is rooted in fakeness and survivalism. When he heard the police closing in on them after he abducted Deb, Brian kneed Dexter in the stomach and fled, leaving Dexter to fend for himself. Even if that meant getting arrested or even killed by police, he protected himself ultimately and let Dexter there to fend for himself, all because Dexter didn't want to kill Deb. Brian has incredibly selfish and vindictive motives, and Dexter could easily become a liability for him and his freedom. He isn't a true partner or confidant. He only presented himself that way so he could get what he wanted. He wanted to take Dexter back from his false family. Not because he loved him, but because he saw Dexter as his. Dexter was right to kill Brian when he had the chance. Keeping him around would have led to the deaths of hundreds of innocents and corrupted Dexter to the point of being one of the disgusting killers he would have otherwise been inspired to get off the streets. It's better that Brian died at Dexter's hand when he did. He was perhaps one of the most deserving people to find themselves at the end of Dexter's knife. As it turns out, Brian Moser met the fate he deserved, assuming that worse couldn't be done to him. Dexter is infinitely better off with it. If you liked this video, check out our breakdown of all the undeserved deaths Dexter caused. Remember to slash that like button and subscribe.